Well, good morning, members of the Commission and Secretary Vonk. Thanks for taking the time to listen today about our little update on our pheasant and prairie grouse harvest from last year. And usually I have a hard time giving a pheasant or grouse presentation without throwing in a few habitat slides at the end, so I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. I'll start out with just our pheasant harvest from last year. As you remember, when the pheasant brood survey came out last year, we did have some counts that were up a little bit from the previous year, which was good news. Unfortunately, our harvest did decline slightly from 2011. 2011, our harvest was a little over 1.5 million. This year, a little bit over 1.4 million. So we did see a little bit of a slide in harvest from last year. When we look at kind of the 10 and 20-year trends, our harvest is slightly lower than our 10-year average and also slightly lower than our 20-year average. If we look at the last 20 years or so, we averaged about 1.5 million birds harvested. During that time period, at least for the 10 years or so, we have had pretty similar hunter numbers, and this was similar to this year. Our resident hunters was nearly unchanged, and we saw a dip of about 3,000 non-resident hunters, which is only a % or 2. If we look at our population estimate, which is generated with a little bit different type of data, our population estimate was actually a little bit higher than the previous year, which seems a little bit odd, but we need to remember that this is a pre-hunt population estimate. It's based on a combination of our harvest, our brood survey sex ratio, and our post-season sex ratio in the pheasants. It's not a big change, but it is worthy to note that it did increase slightly. And again, this doesn't necessarily represent the number of birds that are available to hunters when the season actually opens. Similar to the harvest, this is slightly lower than the 10-year average and the 20-year average. If we just look at the trend over the last 10 to 12 years, as many of you know, we enjoyed absolutely phenomenal pheasant hunting in the mid to late 2000s. This is the time when we had favorable weather conditions, 1.5 million acres of CRP on the ground. It was a good time to be a pheasant in South Dakota. Since 2007, we've seen a pretty continual decline in pheasant abundance. Since 2007, we've lost about 500,000 acres of CRP. We had a few pretty rough winters in there, especially that winter of 2010, when our pheasant abundance dropped pretty substantially from 2010 to 2011. Similarly, our preseason population estimate has kind of shown the same trends. Topped out in 2007, similar to our harvest, and we've seen a decline since then for similar reasons. If we look at our pheasant harvest distribution by county, this map just shows the pheasants harvested per square mile across South Dakota. Similar to past years, the James River Valley and to the west into central South Dakota was definitely the stronghold for pheasants again. The area has a really good mix of grass and cropland, and the pheasant harvest here shows where we have the habitat and where our harvest is occurring. I wanted to show you kind of how the pheasant harvest changed from 2011 to 2012. This map just shows the % change in harvest by county. Anything in that gray color, the harvest changed by less than 10% up or down. So those aren't colored as an up or down just because the change wasn't much from the previous year. The shades of green, the light green is an increase of 10 to 25%, and the dark green is an increase of greater than 25%. The red shadings follow that same trend, except for in the negative direction. So as expected from our brood surveys, we called for an increase in pheasant abundance within the James River Valley and to the east primarily. And it was nice to see a few of those I-29 corridor counties show an increase in pheasant abundance from 2011. Those areas were hit pretty hard since 2007, and it was good to see a little bit of an increase in that area. We did see some pretty substantial declines in harvest, especially in the central portion of the state. Some of this could have been attributed to some of the severe drought conditions we had, especially in that Chamberlain area. Unfortunately, some of these counties here represent a pretty high proportion of our overall harvest. So when we start seeing some declines in harvest by more than 25% in some of those counties, it starts having a pretty good impact on your overall pheasant harvest. we do have some indication that our pheasant survival, especially in that central and south central part of the state, was pretty poor, especially after our brood survey was completed. We had an ongoing research project through SDSU in Lyman County, and we only had an apparent survival of 50% from August 15th through the middle of December with some radio-collared birds. So we do know that survival in that area probably wasn't good, and that could have been attributed to the poor habitat conditions with the drought, and sparse habitat conditions may have concentrated the birds and reduced survival in some of those areas.
Those were all hens, right?
Those were all hens that were radioed adult hens.
So it wouldn't have been harvest then?
Nope. So if we want to look at how our roadside surveys that we complete in August, how does that usually trend with what we expect to see hunters harvest in the fall? And as you can see, as expected, if our brood surveys in August, as they increase, our harvest increases. With a pretty solid trend line, it does a pretty good job, as you can see. But with any survey we do, there's always going to be noise or variation around our estimates. We can't expect our pheasant brood survey to 100% predict what our harvest is going to be in the fall. And I wanted to highlight just our 2011 and 2012 roadside survey counts and how they related to harvest that year. As you can see, the 2012 data with the pheasants per mile of just a little bit over 4 birds per mile, our harvest was about 1.4 million, and it pretty much fits the trend for the last 20 years of data, almost dead on. But if we look at 2011, that's actually one of the most, more of an anomaly. Our harvest was a little bit higher than what we'd expect given our brood survey of about 3.5 birds per mile. So if we maybe get some scrutiny about how our pheasants per mile increased this year, but our harvest declined slightly, we can see it still fits the 20-year average pretty well. I know there's a lot of data on this slide, but I don't want you to get hung up on each year here. But it's just a different way to look at how our pheasant brood counts from August relate to harvest the next year in kind of a different fashion. The blue bars are percent change in pheasants per mile from one year to the next, and the red bars are the percent change in harvest for that same year. So we look at 1991. That year, our brood surveys and our harvest increased by 50% in the same year. They pretty much correlated perfect. But as you can see, if we look at a 20-year data set of this, it's not always true like that. This year, our brood survey was down, our harvest was up. That happened in 2008. But if we also look at some other years, like year 2000 there, it looks like the brood survey was down, but the harvest was up. So like I said, with any survey, they do a pretty good job in the long term, but there's always going to be anomalies in the data set. I also wanted to brief the Commission on some of our efforts to bring some wild birds from within South Dakota out to the newly acquired Hill Ranch, where we have some newly established pheasant habitat. We felt that some of our habitat restoration efforts there were to the point where we could probably start moving a few birds to try to get that island of good pheasant habitat populated. Our intentions were to move 100 birds from the Creek National Wildlife Refuge and 100 birds from the Huron city limits. Our trapping efforts were a little bit tough this year. With pheasant trapping, it's really important to get about 100% snow cover on the ground to entice the birds into traps. In the Creek area, we didn't have much snow for most of the winter, so we only caught about a dozen birds from there. Within the Huron city limits, we were able to get about 65 birds, but trapping conditions were tough. It probably took us well over a month to even catch those birds. It seemed like every time we got a good snowfall, we got a couple days of thawing weather, which was nice in January, but it opened up the hilltops, opened up some of those food supplies, and it made the trapping pretty tough. You may have seen, this was on the Rapid City Journal's web page. We got a little bit of good media coverage with one of the biologists from Rapid City releasing some birds on that property. I have one slide here to also brief the Commission on our prairie grouse harvest from this past year. As you can see, over the last 10, 12, 13 years, our prairie grouse harvest is pretty consistent in that 40 to 50,000 bird range. Obviously, nothing like our pheasant harvest, but an important game bird nonetheless. This past year, our harvest was right at about 50,000, pretty identical to 2011. This was a bit surprising. In the fall, we collect wings from our prairie grouse to estimate the ratio of young birds to adult birds in the harvest. And our production was pretty poor last year, which wasn't a surprise with the really tough drought conditions within our primary grouse range. So it was nice to see our prairie grouse harvest stay pretty stable. If the grouse or if the drought conditions persist, I wouldn't be surprised if that harvest number dips a little bit next year, but we'll just have to see. I've got about 3 slides here at the end here just to talk about some of the habitat trends for upland game birds in South Dakota over the past few years. As most of you know, we have less than 1 million acres of CRP grassland in South Dakota for the first time since CRP was put on the ground in the late 1980s. With the tremendous importance of CRP to pheasants, this is obviously an important trend to keep an eye on, and I think the effects are pretty obvious, and they will be negative. As we look to the future, there's a little bit of uncertainty with CRP because of the Farm Bill. Next year, this summer, we will likely see a new Farm Bill passed, hopefully, and it's hard to say what's in there, but the trends probably will be negative with the fiscal situation of our federal government and the high grain prices. Even with the new CRP, it's hard to say where CRP acres will go, but most likely it won't be a substantial increase. Also, with the surge in grain prices the past few years, we've seen large increases in the amount of sod busting or the conversion of non-CRP grass to cropland. This is a loss of habitat for pheasants and prairie grouse. I have a few slides that show some results of some current research projects that actually put some numbers on some of these. We've also seen in the last 5 years an unprecedented increase in wetland drainage, particularly drain tile drainage. And for certain wetlands, especially some of the ones that grow the emergent vegetation such as cattails, this can result in a loss of winter habitat for pheasants and other wildlife. We've got a couple slides with some results of a research project out of SDSU. They basically looked at land use change in South Dakota and a few adjoining states from the years 2006 to 2011 using some remote imagery techniques. Just this slide here shows the percent change of the landscape from 2006 to 2011 that was grassland in 2006, but either soybeans or corn in 2011. As you can see, eastern South Dakota, our primary pheasant range, is pretty much ground zero for conversion of grassland to corn and soybeans since 2006. Many of these counties have lost 10 to 20% of their grass just a direct conversion to corn and soybeans, and that doesn't count what was maybe converted to wheat or some other small grains. So that's pretty alarming, and we knew this stuff was happening, but this was recently published here a few months ago, and it was a real wake-up call. This is a similar slide here. On the figure A is just the net loss in CRP from 2006 to 2011, and we've had this data for quite some time. We can get this directly from FSA, so this wasn't new. Basically, any county with color, we've lost CRP, and we knew that. But what I really want to direct your attention to is the figure B. And basically what they did here is they calculated how much non-CRP grass was lost in each county and then subtracted it from, or took CRP loss and subtracted this non-CRP loss. So basically, if a county's red on there, they lost more non-CRP grass than they did CRP grass. And some of those dark counties you see up there, such as Beetle, Hand, Spink, Falk counties, they've lost 12,500 to 25,000 more acres of non-CRP grass than actual CRP grass since 2006. That's a pretty alarming number, and it's a number we didn't have until real recently here. So I guess I'll follow up the bad news with a slide that kind of reminds us of spring and what some of our premium pheasant habitat should look like here in a few months or a month from now if we get some rain, and I'd surely take some questions if you have any.
I have one. I didn't catch your name. I'm sorry.
Travis Runia.
Okay. I don't know if I've seen you before. I should know.
Travis, I think the last meeting somebody mentioned, maybe it's Jim, about the numbers of that were put out for hunting season, how, you know, harvest was down and hunting got to be really tough, and then at the end of the season we were still hearing like how great it was to come and hunt in South Dakota. Who's responsible for that, for you know, putting out the
Tourism.
ads or whatever there? Is that just
Tourism, tourism.
You know, basically what we, game fishing parks, we have our pheasant brood numbers, and that is put out in a report around Labor Day every year. And that has our results of our roadside surveys with, you know, there's some verbiage in there that says what hunters should expect. And how that is taken maybe from tourism or Chamber of Commerce, you know, that's not, a lot of the ads you see on TV, that's not coming from us. And I think that's where some of the scrutiny may have occurred, where hunting by some folks' standards was pretty tough, but we're still seeing maybe ads. And those aren't necessarily coming from us, but what we do is present the data we have, make the best prediction we can around Labor Day each year. And this year we did expect hunting to be at least as good as the previous year, if not a little bit better based on our brood surveys with the data we had at that time. And we weren't far off. Our harvest obviously dipped a little bit, and I think a lot of that had to do with some of those big declines in that central part of the state where the drought probably hurt us pretty bad.
so probably some of that comes from tourism and
Yep, I won't speak on anyone else's part, but I know what we present, and that's the data we had in hand.
Go ahead.
I have one comment too. I think this year, looking at the last 35 years, like even at our place, this year from August till fall was the most excessive heat and the least amount of moisture available for the pheasants. So it probably was a little different from brood count to harvest time because of the lack of moisture and the extreme heat that had to affect the pheasants differently than what we've seen in the other years.
Yep, that's certainly one thing that we think happened as well, and it was nice that we had some of those radio-collared birds on the ground in one of the hardest hit areas. And when you have a parent survival of adult birds from mid-August to mid-December at 50%, that's extremely low. We'd like to see annual survival around 50%.
Just need some moisture will help a lot of things.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Done some of those past studies, and it was rare to get any mortality at all during that time frame that Travis is talking about. I mean, usually our mortality on hens is like in April and May is the most difficult time, and the rest of the year is almost just coasting time for those birds. So it was really rare to get this mortality then. The other thing, important point, that every year we try to stress the different counts throughout the different parts of the state, and that what happens in one area of the state is not the same as the rest, and we really encourage hunters to not only look at the localized results, but also talk to their local landowners in here. But by and large, every year, you know, the statewide number is the flagship, and everybody just points to that number and they say, well, you know, that's not happening around here. The game fish said the number was up 20% or down 20%, and they try to apply that locally instead of looking at those localized numbers. So there's always confusion that comes in there. We try to be as fair as we can with the message, but sometimes everybody wants to latch on to just that one number when making a prediction. Still was a good season. Obviously, 1.4 million was a bit of a disappointment, but it still was a really good hunting season for those that were able to get out.
that's still more in all the states around us, isn't it? Combined, yeah.
Huh.
Well, speaking of the message, is this message that we just got, is that on the website too? Are we getting that out to people with the whole presentation, including the habitat?
We like to say that information to get to you here today. We'd like you to be the first to hear it, but we will follow that up with some of the stuff on the website now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Next up,
Lake-wide goose hunting access.
Regional Supervisor Cliff Stone will give us an update of that program. I believe we have a PowerPoint here too.
Madam Chair, members of the Commission, Secretary Vonk. Yes, just a brief overview and update of our Lower Wahi Waterfowl Access Program. And just to start out with a little background perhaps for some of the newer commissioners, starting back in the late 70s through the 80s, 90s,